Hi and welcome to my skills development project. This video I'm going to be covering what I did during the production week of Finishing the Hat, a Sondheim showcase that was performed by Year 13 Musical Theatre that I was the deputy stage manager for. Really, production week didn't start the Monday that the shows were. We started the previous Wednesday evening, where we started to figure out the lighting states that we wanted to use for each number and plotting those in. We did this without the cast, as it would therefore save times when the cast were in the theatre the next day. This overall was very effective, as I was able to write in where the cues were going to happen and what each lighting state was. However, some of the cues were quite tricky to visualise, as there were visual cues that the cast did, and only having the lighting designer and the director be present along with me, meaning that there was no cast that night, it was trying to make sure that once the cast were in the next day, that they were doing the visual cues that I'd already written down. This was also hard, as the videos that we were basing the lighting cues off were from before the summer, when the show was meant to happen, but due to COVID it was postponed. So therefore, I needed to make sure that what was actually happening on stage matched the lighting cues that following day. Overall, the evening where we plotted went really well, and we managed to plot 3/4 of the way through Act 1, saving a lot of time with the cast the following day. The next day started off by making sure that all of the props and costumes were sorted for the cast later on that day, due to tech starting with the cast at 1 PM at the theatre. This also meant that I had to get everything that was needed from Boa to the Old Rep Theatre. I made a props list, but due to there being so many directors for this show, each number being directed by a different person, I sent out one final email to make sure that I hadn't forgotten any props, or they'd forgotten to tell me any props that they'd required. This is really important, as if something or someone hadn't told me that they needed something, it would have been left at Boa and not in the theatre, meaning they couldn't use it for tech later that day. I also spoke to a few different members of my production team about constructing stands for the letters, as I managed to phone a company earlier on in the week to get the letters, light up letters to spell out Sondheim. However, due to the Old Rep having a rake stage and us not being allowed to drill into the letters as they were hired, we couldn't fly them in. We needed to figure out a way of securing them to a podium that was higher than the steel deck, which was 2 foot, but also matching the director's vision so they were higher up. I waited for the letters to arrive and measured them all, and then spoke to different set designers to see what their opinions were about the best way to make this podium and make them stand up, but also a way to make sure the letters were safe and secure on the raked stage. After many discussions and many ideas being thrown around, we settled on having a podium with a small strip of wood in the front and in the back, meaning that the letters could just slide in and still be safe and secure, as well being higher than the steel deck. I told the constructors about the idea, as well as getting all the measurements that they needed and writing them down where necessary, so that they could build this, as due to having tech rehearsals that day, I was unable to help build it myself. Before the tech rehearsal started with the cast, me and the rest of the production team took all of the necessary props and costumes down to the theatre, as they would need these props for the rehearsals, also meaning that I could then write down what props were needed for what scene in what number, and what needed to be preset before the top of the show and during the interval. It's really important that we had all of these props during the tech rehearsal, as I needed to make sure that the props looked okay on stage, as some of them might not look effective during the number and mean that I needed to find something else. I also needed the cast to get used to doing the numbers with the props that they were going to actually use in the show, as if the show was the first time that the cast were using the actual props, it could have been a disaster. The rest of that day we spent doing tech. Due to the night before plotting in some of the numbers, we needed to run these with the cast to make sure they were hitting their marks and that the lighting worked for these numbers. This also meant that some of the numbers needed reblocking and or re-choreographing. This was important, otherwise the actors wouldn't be able to be in the light, therefore the audience would be unable to see them. This took up a considerable amount of time though, as the casts were also getting used to being on the stage, as it was the first time they were in the theatre as well. The reblocking also took up so much time, as once we'd got the numbers in place and we'd plotted them the previous night, we had to start plotting the other numbers as well. Our aim was to get to the end of Act 1 that night, however we only managed to plot up to America, leaving the last 2 numbers to be plotted. This was due to how much time it took for the cast to reblock numbers to fit the stage, and making sure that the numbers that were already plotted, making sure they matched the movements that the actors were doing so that the lighting states would work. The following day we only had 2 hours in the theatre with the cast. This meant that we focused on making sure that we'd teched up to the end of Act 1. Due to the previous evening tech rehearsals going on so slowly, we were now massively running behind schedule, and I spoke to the production manager about how we were running so far behind. She then spoke to the director about this and about how he needed to cut cues down, as he doesn't have the time to keep plotting loads and loads of different lighting states for the different numbers. This was effective as the second half of the show was plotted a lot quicker and a lot more effectively. Also, the cast and reblocking took a lot quicker time than it was originally. We managed to make it to the end of Act 1 and started teching the first part of the first number of Act 2. However, our time in the theatre with the cast was up for that day, but me, the director and the lighting designer came back later on the day to plot all of the lighting sets that would be needed in Act 2. This saved a lot of time as then on Monday when the cast came back, we could just go through the numbers and make sure that they were hitting their marks and making sure that the numbers were properly lighted, which saved a considerable amount of time as we weren't deciding what lighting state we needed for what number as it was already plotted. On the Monday, we went through all of the numbers that we managed to plot on the Friday, making sure that all the lighting cues were in the correct place in the script and that I had the correct numbers when I had to call it. This was also the first day which I had the follow spot operators, so I made sure that I was constantly communicating with them about who needed to be followed at what point and also cueing them from my book, which I'd already written down. This was really important as they needed to get used to their track of where the actors are going and which actors to follow at which point, so constant communication was really important, and without this they wouldn't have known who they were following and when they were following them. We managed to get through the whole of the act minus the finale, therefore it was a really successful day of tech, as now everything was teched again minus the finale and bows, which they hadn't even sorted yet. Therefore, lighting wise it was perfect, with the only thing we hadn't started to tech was microphones. On the Tuesday, it was our first day of teching with microphones, so there was a lot of stopping and starting. We only managed to get through the first act as we only had 3 hours in the theatre, and we were running through the numbers to make sure that everything technically was perfect, as well as making sure that all the props were where they needed to be in the correct time at the correct place. As well as it being my first day of having the whole production team present, therefore needing to make sure that everyone knew where they were going at what times. Overall, this went really well, however, due to it only being able to run Act 1, it now meant that we were further and further behind schedule, meaning that we would not have time to do a full dress run the following day, before the show, as there simply isn't enough time, meaning that the first time that we'd run the show from top to bottom completely with dress and everything would be the actual show that night. On the Wednesday, the first show day, we started off the day by running through Act 2, stopping and starting to make sure that all the numbers were correct and that all the microphones were working properly, and that we sound-checked all the numbers in that act to make sure that you could hear them. We also ran through the finale and the bows for the first time. This was where we plotted the lighting states for the end of the show, including the preset. Also, this was the first day where we had the light-up letters that spelled out Sondheim, so we needed to program them into the lighting states that they required. This was really important to be added in as they added to the aesthetic and they were part of the director's vision. We also needed to make sure that they were in the correct states for when the director wanted it, as it added a massive wow factor to the show and made it look really professional to the audience. When it came to before the show, I made sure that everything was preset, also due to the aprons not looking correctly during the tech run earlier on in that day. In the dinner break, I sent one of my ASMs to go and get red paint. Therefore, before the show, I had to use my hands to rub paint onto the aprons to make it look like blood had been splattered on them and stained all down them for the Sweeney Todd number, Worst Plays in London. This looked really effective and much improved on the job that my ASM did earlier that day, as when they stained it, it looked like someone had spilt juice on them when it came to be under the lighting. When it came to the show, it was my first time ever calling from a proper prompt desk. This therefore made the show more nerve-wracking for me, as I wasn't used to the view or hearing what I would hear from the desk, as again, we didn't have time to do a full dress run where I'd normally call from it. And also, I wasn't used to calling on the proper prompt desk. However, I do believe that I really developed my skills as a stage manager throughout the show, as I'm now more confident and capable of calling a show from a prompt desk. The first act was a little bit shaky as I was getting used to the view that I'd have, as well as not being able to hear them, and adjusting the monitors to make sure that I could hear what the actors were saying, as well as the music. However, throughout the show, I managed to develop my confidence and call effectively, still making sure that everything was going smoothly for the show. This made me feel more confident for the show the next day, as my confidence was developing throughout the show. Overall, the Wednesday night show was okay, but due to this being our first full run of the show from top to bottom, a few numbers didn't work out and were a bit messy. Also, there are a few issues with props and quick changes being in the wrong place backstage, as well as not being able to grab props or the wrong prop being at the wrong place at the wrong time. This was sorted though, however, by either the cast or the ASM. I couldn't do it as I was calling the show. That evening, I made sure to put a cohesive show report together that went in depth about every issue that happened. I then emailed this out to all of the production team, including all the directors, to make sure that the same problems wouldn't happen again on the following night. On the Thursday night, we started off by doing notes with the cast and the crew. I gave my notes that I had on the show report and also made sure that all the corrections that anyone else in the production team had for the cast was communicated effectively. This is really important as I need to make sure that all the problems that had happened in the show would not happen again, as the same problem can't happen more than once. We then ran through the numbers that went really wrong the night before and made sure that they were cleaned up and that the errors had been adjusted. This again is to refrain from the same mistakes happening twice. I was then called over by the director, and due to a few cast members being ill overnight, he made the decision to cut this number, A Little Night of Music, from the show. This then meant that I had to communicate with all the departments to edit the QLab file for sound, editing the lighting cue stack, as well as there being fly cues in that number, and communicating that with the person working on flies so that they could skip the cues for that number. I then made sure that everything was adjusted in my prompt copy, that the numbers were still the same for each department so that I could still call it effectively. But also, deleting the cues, as this was our final show, was okay, but if it wasn't our final show, we would have to edit the cue stack and then re-edit it if the number was to come back in. This meant that I had to stay really calm, and I learnt so much about what happens in the industry when a number is cut from a show, further developing my skills as a stage manager even more than before. I felt really confident going into the show that even though a number had been cut and it was the first time we were running this number of the show, that it was going to be really successful, as my mind was calm that it was going to work. Once we ran through the numbers that needed it, it was showtime. This was where I had to make sure that everything was preset and got ready to call the final performance of Sondheim, Finish in the Hat. Overall, the performance was much improved on the previous night, with all the numbers going really well and having no issues with props. There was only one cue that was called slightly early, but apart from that, the show was a real success. I again made sure to write down notes during the performance and compile these notes into a cohesive and well-structured show report to email out to the directors and the rest of the production team. Overall, in this production process, I learned a lot about putting a show together in such a short amount of time. I learned how to call effectively with more cues and a longer show than I'd ever called before. I also really developed my skills in communicating with a larger production team and communicating with companies to get the letters that were required in such a short amount of time. In all, this whole process developed my skills as a stage manager so much, which I'm now able to use in productions in the future.